Hello, everyone. It is August 5th, 2022, and we're coming at you from the Curio slash art slash science slash NFT online intersection. Today, we're going to be having a conversation NFT art and decentralized science. It's going to be a panel discussion, and we have some guests and collaborators here that'll be sharing their experiences, and we'll see where it all goes as we try to weave together science, art, and NFTs, looking at some similarities and some differences, some interesting tensions. We'll first begin with everyone introducing themselves in however they want to, and also mentioning one interesting NFT or art or science related topic that they're excited to share about. So, whoever would like to go for it, let's begin with introductions and then we can move on to some questions that we're having. Maybe
I'll
Gokul
go.
first? Yes, please. And then Max, then Shadi.
Hi, I'm Gokul. I'm a researcher in neuroscience based in Europe. And the NFT idea, I would say it's using NFT for public engagement in science, which is exactly what Cyberse is about. So, yeah, that's from me.
Could you give a brief overview on that?
Yeah, it's basically using science, sci art to engage public in the scientific discoveries, in the sense that you hear a lot about like scientific discoveries in the newspapers, which are mostly like a bit exaggerated and things like this, right? You don't really get to know the science, and you can really condense all of the science of a paper. So there's this hashtag running on Twitter, if you check, like single plot. So you can like condense the discovery in one plot. So what if you could like tokenize this one plot, and people who are interested in the science enthusiast can collect it, and like and the cool thing is that it's something that it has no value at this point when it's published, right? And it's a test of time, like which science stands the test of time. And same with your collectible. So you would just cherish it and then figure out like what happens to this piece of science with you. So I think that's a very nice way to engage people to like the science that's happening today, which otherwise I see that it's like, no, I mean, it's very difficult to keep up with what's happening, even as a scientist. I mean, what's happening in other fields of science, it's, yeah. So I think it's a way to engage people by actively participating in it. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks to Max.
Hey guys, so happy to be here. My apologies if you hear some weird noises in the background. Yeah, so I'm Max. I'm also a Curio card artist, and as Daniel is, I did 27, 28, 29, and I've been working crypto for for almost 5 years now, closer to six. Been in crypto since the beginning with making my own currency, getting into using art as community engagement. And so my background is in how to leverage art to increase value in communities or have shared experiences. And so I've been doing that, since like 2005 or so. Made my own currency 2007. Fast forward till today. Now I work with this blockchain game called Alien Worlds. And there is this mining component which use NFTs, and it's primarily to educate people about DAOs. So that was the initial products they made. They made tools for DAOs, and this first activity they used as kind of like a token distribution event or NFT distribution event, turned it into the most used blockchain application by users. And so we have around it's like 200,000 to 300,000 daily active users. And yeah, you would think it would be like Ethereum's most used blockchain application, but it isn't. It's actually this game Alien Worlds that runs on with the Wax blockchain. So super bizarre that I'm I get to work on what I truly love. And yeah, just a couple more things about Alien Worlds. The DAOs are actually in-game pieces. So this means that these are accumulating with tokens, and users can extract value out of these DAOs if they get elected. But also these DAOs can hold other forms of community resources, and that's what I'm really interested in. So it's not that it's just holding something that people trade for dollars. It could hold other stores of value that are important to that community. So I'm applying community engagement to some of these DAO things. I've been part of many DAOs over the years, and looking forward to the direction of it. And I definitely think that's an awesome component into successful DeSci and adding value in those communities as well. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Max.
Cool. Yeah, that's fascinating, Max and Gokul. That's really fascinating. I bet Elizabeth Bick could fund her work if she minted every one of those images or figures that she's been able to find and refute. Just a little side comment there. So yeah, hi everybody. Really excited to be here today amongst some of the OGs in the NFT space and also the DeSci space. My name is Shady. I'm trained as a neuroscientist. I just got my PhD a couple of years ago. I've been working in Web3 and DeSci since for the past 2 years. So I'll make sure there we go. Cool. So I'm a neuroscientist. I'm specifically really interested in multimodal imaging, really interested in how biophysical mechanisms lead to intelligent behavior. I love MRI. I think it's one of the most fascinating, magical pieces of technology that's ever been invented. It's kind of insane that it actually works. I've had the privilege of seeing our scanner at Georgetown completely disassembled and reassembled by a crack team of German engineers that's counted and properly calibrated the torque of 30,000 screws, giving me new appreciation for that technology. Really interested also in data engineering, data sharing, and open science, which is why today I'm the founder and president of Opsciencia, or OpSci for short, which is one of the first open science, I like to say, proto-DAOs, because we're still figuring out exactly what a DAO that does science really looks like and what's the right design pattern there for that. Also currently working right now very deeply on identity in decentralized web native communities, and how do we really actually, how should we treat identity? How do we link the different personas that we have across the web, both in Web 2 and Web 3, and do so in a way that's privacy preserving, that empowers or uplifts users. And for me specifically, I'm really interested in how we can transcend legacy academic credentials like the PhD. Yes, I have one, but it's I don't think you necessarily need this credential to be able to basically open the doors or do the work that many other PhDs do. So that's kind of like my interest and some of my philosophical leanings, probably into it some more from there, I guess. And and I'm really excited to be here. I think there was a question too about what was my the NFT question, or is that
like
related?
What's something exciting or underappreciated about NFTs?
Yeah. All right. So I feel like there's quite a few I could pick from, but I'm really excited actually about impact certificates. I think that this is something that's brand new, that's under development from Protocol Labs. Hasn't really been released yet, though there's been tons of technical conversations and events and workshops and GitHub activity and pull requests happening behind the scenes. Impact certificates you can think of are a maturation of the NFT hype cycle, where we've moved beyond just simply tokenizing a piece of art or a JPEG or an open source contribution and just tossing it on some secondary market or like OpenSea and just selling it on its own as a one-off example, right? So that was the kind of the first hype cycle the low-hanging fruits, the immediate gold rush. Impact certificates are fascinating because they're built specifically for both proactive and retroactive funding of public goods, where you can link the impact of a particular project or its sub-projects or milestones with perhaps the budgets or perhaps the requirements to actually fund that work. You can think of them as kind of like baseball cards, where you could have your favorite scientist or your favorite project as this collectible that's dynamic, that's changing, that responds to updates within the ecosystem, that represents dynamically the impact that that project has. And there's lots of ways to do this. And yeah, and so it allows philanthropists and individuals that really depend, and organizations that really depend on quantitative demonstration of the impact of their donated funds to be able to say, hey, look, I made IPFS happen, or I contributed to the development of the first active inference use case for artificial intelligence and robotics or something, right? And it's also links together individuals or organizations or protocols that assess and I guess like notarize, kind of like these actuaries for impact, and being able to link them with these philanthropists to establish kind of this trust over what the impact is, as well as the individuals that are being able to be funded for this work. And they're very interesting because you can they have this mathematical formulation where you can define a space of impact along with specific milestones or timelines or deliverables or deterministic criteria that unlock the funds that are locked into it, as one example. And some even have proposed that these impact certificates could even be speculated upon for future impact, right? So you could imagine the active inference impact certificate today might have, some low speculative, ability, like, oh, well, maybe one day it'll change Jan LeCun's mind and he'll think very carefully about how to think about artificial intelligence and multi-agent reasoning and how prompt D is going to change over time to account for some problems in AI. And say like a couple months from now, somebody releases an earth-shattering paper on active inference that really demonstrates these things, and so people will see like, oh my goodness, this impact certificate 3 months from now, or 1 year from now, or 2 years from now, when this research is complete, is going to be very valuable. It's going to have a really high impact. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to buy this impact certificate and hold it until the impact is sufficient enough, and then resell it. And so you can tap into the raw, primordial energy of degen economics to be able to fund public goods and impact for open source projects, which I'm really excited about, and can't wait for this technology to be released.
Nice. Thanks all for this first round of thoughts. Just a quick reflection on a little bit of what each of you mentioned, then I'll bring us to the first question. So Gokul, you mentioned engagement with science and art, and I think that'll be a really interesting thread to pull out. How is engagement with science, art, and their intersection historically been? And what specifically do some emerging technologies have to do, and how is that changing that intersection? And that brings us to Max and the mention of community structure and kind of emergence of people being people, which is happening in digital spaces. And so again, the way in which different technologies like NFT and the whole continuum play a role in that. And then Shady, the way you described OpSci as a proto DAO, there's nothing in those 3 letters that describe how formal, informal, blockchain, how any technology gets implemented. Although maybe in certain conversations, it has a certain connotation that it's going to be one way or another. But once somebody dips into the space of DAOs and modern organization, there's DAOs that are really coordinating to a large extent through blockchain, public ledger technology, through private blockchain technology, and even to a very limited extent, or even not at all, and who's to say that that organization isn't also on the decentralized and autonomous continuum? So, to whoever dares, there's a pair of questions. What is decentralized science? Or you can answer, what is art? One word answers only, please. No, but what is decentralized science for somebody who is familiar with science as a mechanism, as a way of asking questions, as a career? What does decentralized science mean? And again, also feel free to address what art is to you.
Maybe I could jump in here. We've given this quite a bit of thought. I think Daniel and I we've had a couple of conversations about this, and um, you know, this is a definition that kind of comes just from these limited conversations that I've had, and I'm not sure it captures the full scope of what DeSci means to every single person on the internet today. But what I can say about DeSci, or decentralized science, is that it's a web native movement. It's really young. And the understanding that I have of it is the goal is to deploy these scientific web services or digital services and applications on neutral ground territory, on decentralized internet protocols that are autonomous, meaning that they execute indefinitely following some deterministic criteria and rely on consensus mechanisms for trustlessness, right? And as a consequence of their decentralization or distributed nature, they're community owned, meaning that there's no single one party that can flip the switch on or off or decide how the protocol runs or whose interests it serves or where the profits, if there are any, go. And so that's kind of that's the definition that I immediately go to, and I think you could definitely drill that down a little bit. You can extract out some of these key properties that are associated with autonomous DeSci protocols, where you're thinking of some knowledge curation as a key component, and it's an engineered process, right? Where knowledge curation is something that isn't just done by somebody who goes to the library and checks a couple books out and writes some paper on Google Docs and sends it to his friend, but it's this meticulous indexing, archival, and dissemination into a public record that's accessible, that's transformable, that's adaptable, and can be used to generate secondary, tertiary, and so on, nth order knowledge artifacts. I believe there's also a strong kind of component there, if we're continuing to drill down into it, of linked and verified content. So being able to, if you're going to have knowledge as this engineered process, you're going to have to be able to verify content, identities, methods. And you can even take these ideas further and explore if you have these autonomous curation agents for knowledge, you could even start thinking about things like algorithmic grant making, right? Where you have some finite resources that you need to allocate most efficiently with some prior knowledge, and decide, if we're going to explore the state space of the universe, what's the right way to do so? How do we establish boundary conditions to be able to most efficiently converge to discovery that accelerates further discovery, right? So that's that would be my kind of overall sort of take on it.
Thank you, Gokul.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of these points, and to me, it's very powerful to give the decision making and the power of and also the results that you get out of experiments to be able to own them in within a community. This is a very powerful idea, and I think this is like the best points that I can think of having a decentralized science environment, decision making and the rules.
One thought on that is a lot of the contexts where research has been carried out, just to simplify or coarse grain, like industry settings or academic settings. In fact, the work that is done by all kinds of researchers and knowledge workers in those organizations, they're often under a contract or a sort of pre-blockchain law concept that people are still learning about. That means that the fruits of those knowledge activities do belong to the bigger organization. And so it's a specific symmetry. Won't say it's asymmetric because there is reciprocity and there are things that are provided by the supporting institution, industry, or academic, but there's a pretty clear ownership policy, which is that it's not yours unless we've like checked, and then we'll maybe give it to you or we'll give some of it back to you. And the decision-making component is nowhere to be found. The relationship between the participant in science ultimately and the institution that has like a priori claim on their product, the relationship is kind of like a human resources relationship. Super important. But then now in this modern era of organization, the relationship between the individual and the communities, like in the plural now, which they can be nested within, that relationship can include decision making, governance and meta governance, and even some ownership concepts that I feel are like just beginning to be fleshed out. So Gokul, any other thoughts on that? Or Max, happy to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, let's hear from Max.
Yes, please, Max.
Oh, sorry about that. I was on mute, guys. Yeah. Oh man, there's so many good things to unpack there. Yeah, I see that a lot when architecting the DAOs. Like, how do we provide value to these like traditional communities and make these concepts accessible? And I mean, that's such a huge challenge. It's like we have this Web 2 where it's like siloed and insulated and in what's accessible and who can be owners and who can't be owners. And some of those things work pretty good. I mean, we get to invent technology from institutional research, and it can either be used in the private sector or the military. So I mean, even that's a little bit limited in like what can be done with it. At least from what I've seen from like research institutions and loosely being part of some entrepreneurial projects that are within the institution. It's like, yeah, I've seen some cool programs happen there that were kind of groundbreaking in how to, get like early seed funding for projects. But generally speaking, it's like, just seems like categorically, it's like, it's what's the outcome? It goes to, military or more stuff. And I don't know, it's almost it seems really limiting there. I think for the Web3 biggest problem is like, well, how do we know how do we assess what things are good that we can pull over from that traditional structure, those traditional systems, and then overlay these more equitable structures that come out of like the Web3 stuff. Like, yeah, like how do you so I'm looking like, how do you put DAOs into these traditional things, and like what's the path to do that? And so I've been pretty involved in like how the DAOs are going to be architected. How do we not alienate these communities from the traditional structures? How do you not put like business logic first when trying to connect them to these these newer communities that have new values and new community or cultural attributes? You don't want to offend the new ones. You don't want to offend the old ones. And these are like real challenges that we're having right now with Alien World. So yeah, I'm super excited that you guys are here discussing these things, because it's like this is where these things can be solved. Like it's so cool to see these themes you guys are bringing up.
And non-science and non-art DAOs are exploring really important areas in that phase space. And so it's almost like that DAO to DAO learning. We want to find out what structures are working in other communities, like the profile picture to every other kind of community. And then similarly, when you said that, I thought, how could research and science be embedded and fostered within communities that don't think of themselves as scientific? Like any city in the world, there are people who are doing different things. And so similarly, perhaps some communities online will be very special interest and be oriented around a single skill or like a single song or a single collection. In many cases, there might also be like a broader coming together because the DAO will, unless it's like a cult DAO, these people will be participating in other things and they'll bring their multifaceted identities to that community. And there's going to be so many interesting learnings in all directions. Yeah, go for it. Any other thoughts on this, or I'll go to another question? Let's turn to the art side. Perhaps just openly, what's something about the relationship between art and science that's important today? How has the relationship with art and science been, and what about this moment brings importance to the intersection of art and science?
I think of
yeah, Shady, go for it.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah, feel free to hop in, Max. Yeah, so I think of Ramoni Cajal as kind of like as an inspiration of how arts and science are incredibly commingled, that they're necessary for each other to drive the other forward. And when we think about art, right, also we maybe perhaps at the immediate as a third party onlooker studying the artist as an observer, we might see it as kind of like this mysterious process. It involves a lot of talents, and it's creative and esoteric, and involves kind of perhaps non-grounded, ephemeral sort of actions or states or processes. But in a lot of ways, I think the artists and the scientists are very similar in the sense that they need to constantly iterate and improve and test and falsify, whether the colors that they're matching really matches the perspective that they're trying to capture, or whether whether the feeling or the experience that they're going for really kind of is best instantiated with some set of tools or some medium. And so Ramoni Cajal is fascinating because he was exploring. He captures some of the very first images of neurons, and these fractal type patterns, basically letting the whole world know that, hey, there's like these cells called neurons and they make you think somehow. That's crazy. And somehow these fractal type patterns, they could, pass for like, really beautiful, like fractal patterns on like a tree trunk after a lightning strike, right? But the thing is that these are biological entities and they perform functions, and they're really important for studying disease and behavior and everything about that relates to human society. So to answer your question, where do art and science meet, and where they're going and how they inform each other, I think in a lot of ways they are kind of the same. There is definitely a science to art, and that is very much informed by our own cognitive processes and mechanisms. And I think we kind of do art and science a disservice by putting them into their own different camps and saying like, oh, well, you're the artist, you have to do things this way, and you're the scientist, you have to be boring and do your math proofs in the corner over there. But I think that's when we put these two together, we really get closer to touching, I think, the real unlocked, or the real kind of like locked states of inspiration and transcendence that inspires people like Roger Penrose, for example, to really blow our minds with completely different physical or geometrical manifestations or perceptions that informs physics and mathematics and so on.
Thanks. Cool.
Yeah, I think there are lots of similarities between science and art, and it's in a way underappreciated how much creativity you need in science, right? So just like artists, I mean, it's a very creative pursuit, except that as a scientist, you have a canvas which is limited by the laws of science, and you have to make your theories around that. So I think that way there are like really a lot of similarities between the process of doing science and doing art. And yeah, I think that way you see the similarities. And then also people people can more easily engage and appreciate aesthetic beauty in art, and that then is a very nice way uh, to to then let them know through the art about science. So that I think that's a nice territory, like to combine science and art and engage people more. I mean, I'm coming back to the engagement factor, but yeah, I will pass it on to Max.
Max, if you want to add anything,
Oh,
I'll
oh yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'll take a stab. Oh man, it's this one. This question is difficult. So, as a visual artist most of my life, and then I got into like conceptual art, and so visual art and science. I've seen some connections how they're similar with different art movements and kind of like advancements in society. So like you can kind of see things like visual art evolve over time, um, and science evolve over time to just more perspectives and more perceptions. Um, so I think both of them, facilitate bridges of understanding for different communities. And I think possibly in the future, art and science will be indistinguishable from each other. Like, might have to have like some other, just because how creative both of those are and how they're evolving. But yeah, getting into more conceptual stuff. Um, yeah, I see that art doesn't necessarily need to just be like something pretty or beautiful. It can be more experiential and almost it isn't art. Like it's almost something else. It's more it could be even activism or more research, and so I think that there's some unresolved issues for me about where that's going with the conceptual stuff on the science side. But yeah, I definitely think we'll see more more blurring the lines between those as we can constantly just like redefine those for what they really are. It seems like the decentralized science stuff definitely starts blurring the lines, in the same way like, are you a researcher? Are you not a researcher? Or, you could literally just have like a single discovery and get paid out for that, and never even have like an academic career. And same with being an artist. Like everyone's an artist now. They got a cell phone in their pocket, and they got to access these incredible tools. So yeah, both of them, the tools are becoming hyper accessible, and so anyway, yeah, there's a lot more there for sure.
So just a few remarks. Importantly added, Max, that not all art is static visual forms, whether they're created in an analog media or digitally. NFTs, as they're currently known, have been very heavy on the static visuals, and indeed the internet discourse, image memes and all of that is very much favoring that genre. And so it's so funny when it's like people have accepted the JPEG NFT. Oh, you can't do a music NFT, and it's just like on to the next media format. So that's one important point. And then Coco, you said something really fascinating there, which is like that the canvas is limited by science. Like the canvas is limited by the nature of the embodiment of the canvas is the limitation and the opportunity, with the paint dripping from gravity and with the lava lamp and buoyancy and like all these different features that generate beauty are the forces and phenomena which are addressed with a different lens by science. And so you had canvas is limited by science, and then the reflection of that is also that science is like limited or extended by art. People do talk about a beautiful finding. It's different than a beautiful symphony, but it has many similarities in that it reflects rigor and the authenticity of the expression. If the sound quality were degraded, it could still be a beautiful song, but the sound was not perfect, and so on. And so that really highlights that similarity in their target phenomena, and then even down to the really micro with the practices and the way that they are lifelong practices. Working in a biological lab, there's fine scale and large scale finger movements. You're pipetting and you're moving boxes around and you're mixing things in ratios. And when pulling back to that level, that probably sounds a lot like some people in their artistic work too. And then just a last thought, and then anyone can either add a reflection or we can go to a next question is, yes, NFT is a cool acronym and interesting technology that does bring us together as a specific, but technology is just a broader categorization than any specific NFT or blockchain technology. And the progression of science is often reflected by technology and in feedback with it, but also the progression of art is in many ways embedded within technology. And I'm sure it's been explored on both of those sides of the triangle many, many, many times. But just technological changes change the game for art. The printing press changes the game, and Photoshop changes the game. And so this art, science, and technology shape starts to form, and we find ourselves in a unique position at this moment, and every person who dips into these infinite games in the future will also find themselves in a unique situation in terms of what scientific, artistic, and technological features they find around them. Any thoughts from any of you, or I'll go to another question?
Yeah, I got a thought. That's really interesting. I think, that line of thought regarding how art and science are kind of like this eternal dragon chasing its tail. So one thing I think of immediately is the Fourier transform, right? So you have this scientific results that came, from Joseph Fourier, who's studying the heat wave, and he was looking at how you could decompose any sort of signal by expressing it as an infinite series of sines and cosines that lets you reconstruct that signal, right? There's definitely, I think, a beauty that resonates with humans that really like to see completion and like neat corners tucked, and there's an elegance to that. But what's fascinating is Joseph Fourier unintentionally invented digital signal processing that would come to characterize, an entire movement of music and expression of music. And so I kind of think of, it kind of presents the, you kind of see, you can kind of see the mathematical forms or the scientific result that's generated as this artifact or object that's primordial, that's has a lot of latent potential energy. And arts, and by itself, maybe it's interesting and fascinating, and you can poke it and prod it, but you don't really know what it's capable of. It's like an infinity stone, right? Like you see it, you can wonder about it, you're like, whoa, this is some crazy stuff. But nobody really knows what it's capable of until the artist hones, the capacities or the potential of that. And so you need people like, Aphex Twin, or like, I don't know, the Gorillas. I like the Gorillas. And, they take these expressions and forms and turn them into other variations that then co-inspire us to come back to the drawing board and think of other kind of completely unrelated components of that particular math or science. So for example, the cognition of music, or the detection of sound in particular wavelengths, or I'm sure there's tons of science that's been inspired just from the expression of music using digital signal processing based off of the Fourier equations. So yeah, so I really find that thought compelling of science as creating kind of like this crystal shard that looks cool when you walk past it, but you don't really know what it's capable of until an artist shows up and harnesses its powers and abilities.
And it's not a wearable necklace until somebody crafts that even beyond it. Max?
Oh man, yeah, I love that. That's I see that a lot. I definitely see artists taking tools to a whole nother level. Like those, science ends up creating these problems and solutions, and artists take it a step further and create even more problems and inspire other solutions. There's this in this discussion. I just remembered this these old like Japanese no, I think it might have been like Chinese, so like even older, like Chinese linoleum cuts of like fireworks going off, and you see like a full moon. It's like a full moon celebration or Lunar New Year celebration, and and if you look at this imagery out of context, you're like, oh yeah, those are spaceships going to the moon. And I kind of wonder if like people had seen those things like centuries later and got inspired to to go to the moon with a spaceship looking thing. So I think art can also like accidentally inspire other things unintentionally as well. So it's kind of like a random inspiration generator for more technical or more science minded people. And yeah, I mean, you see it vice versa. The artist is employing these tools in unconventional ways, or bridging these tools to exotic concepts and new lines of thinking. But yeah, this is very rewarding conversation. So thank you guys.
To dive into maybe one point of contact between art and science and technology, how does the role of provenance and the origination of information, how do we track and make sense of it without getting lost in just infinitely branching paths? How do we balance our desire to understand the origins of information while also moving ahead and using it?
Should I take this one? Maybe.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think there's definitely a mathematical perspective there you could take, where if you're looking at knowledge as a graph in time and space, right? So the graph can have other things. A particular knowledge item, you could say like start off with single statements and maybe some accessory clauses like the sky is blue, or like yeah, you can imagine like some system of logical statements that define, I am a person, I have eyes with photoreceptors that detect in this wavelength, and I looked up and the sky was blue. And from there, you can say, okay, this is the, original Genesis node, and you can continue adding additional nodes to that down the line, saying, okay, well, now I've, a couple epochs later, I'm, an individual with, access to resources, and I can craft these lenses that show me that the sky is also these other colors. And so, I think how you represent that information is really critical in how accessible that information actually is to those that receive it down the line. And I think there's some pretty deep implications here in this topic. I think you can dive into like very specific problems about democracy and communication, and how do we talk about things and how do we have context. But maybe we can avoid that. We can stay at the higher level. And so you have this spatial kind of relation, right? Like where you have like these nodes and they're connecting to each other, and over time they're being added. And depending on the expressive language that you're using for this graph structure, you can collapse or transform it or perform different types of embedding or compressions that allow you to project perhaps these higher dimensional relationships between them, right? Like if you're looking at, like say you could do a simple like a word vec, right? If from machine learning, or some sort of like similarity algorithm that looks to see how each of the co-occurrences of the statements or the words that you're using clusters across this all the instances or instantiations of a particular statement or the words that are in that statement. So I think a lot of Kolmogorov complexity as a metric to kind of evaluate these networks and thinking about like what's the minimal set of instructions that I need to execute to be able to produce a result or traverse that graph. And the human brain is probably really, really good at that. It's really, really good at, because it had to survive. It only has so much space. Not only the human brain, like I'm sure you would disagree with me and say ants could do a really good job as well. But I think, any sort of biological system that has limited constraints, like our heads only have so much space, our neurons can only be so long, they can only consume so much energy, we can only breathe so quickly, that our brain is really good at creating these really information dense, like low dimensional projections of really high dimensional data that we can transform and project into different spaces and turn like that infinity stone or that prism around in different ways and be able to access what it is, depending on the context or this, depending on like whatever it is that we're how we're looking at it, right? So in terms of provenance, I guess I'm kind of making this a little bit more applied or maybe perhaps more explicit. So I think in terms of provenance, how we keep track of it, I think it's really important to have something like a shared language or an ontology that everyone understands what those words mean, that it's accepted, that it's common knowledge, it's common sense. And that ontology should be able to be every statement that's made from that ontology should be able to be recorded in a shared record or a shared ledger. And that shared record or shared ledger allows us to trace those connections from each other. And then I think down the line, as time goes on and knowledge is added to the discourse graph, we'll be able to apply different types of transformations to that knowledge graph, depending on the context of the use that we require, to be able to pull out the perspective or the view that we need. And sometimes maybe those perspectives or views are going to be contradictory, and they're not going to like answer our questions all the time. And we'll just have to kind of like pick what's the best answer based off of our needs or our best guess or gut reflex. But yeah, no, I think it's really exciting work. There's some great stuff being done by this researcher. I think his name is Joel Chan at the University of Maryland. And he's looking at discourse graphs as kind of this mechanism for tracking conversations interoperably across the web. And he has some really great examples. If you just Google discourse graphs, Joel Chan, you should be able to find his paper. He has some really great examples of how, in practice, you could build these things across platforms, across, operating systems. And you can even start imagining like this hyper-connected communicative society where, political discourse always has context. You just have to be willing to unfold the context. Very fascinating. That's a great question. I really thank you, Daniel.
Thanks. Google or Max, would you like to on this, or please take it wherever you'd like?
I mean, those are really very interesting thoughts. I don't know if I have anything to add there. It's very interesting.
On the graph complexity, like two different notions of information and complexity, and we won't go into any equations or last names or anything, but one could imagine that one way to summarize data is in terms of how much space it takes to store it, like how many gigabytes are on the hard drive, whereas another metric of information could be like, as Shady mentioned, like the complexity associated with a program that generates that information. So you could store 100 gigabytes of the digits of pi, but have a quite short iteration-based program that generates those. That kind of gives an interesting lens on what is complexity in art and in technology, because if you count all the tiny leaves of paper and all the scribbles, that is a copious amount of information. And then, like you pointed out, with the human sense-making apparatus, being able to really intuitively flow through these short paths and find distal connections that help stitch the knowledge together, and then also find really short generative programs that can summarize and give a ton of context. Like I see Pablo has written, Da Vinci and many others did not differentiate between art and science as much as we do today. So then somebody could say, well, at this time with these pieces of information, and then Da Vinci came to this conclusion. And so it's almost like zooming in from so far out to just get right into that one moment of creation, of innovation, if it's scientific or artistic. And that's like somebody recounting their insight path. And now we're in a situation where the humans, with the limitations of short-term memory and all just time and all of that, we're on our own insight paths. Song to song that we like, curating a few playlists. Image to image that we like, saving things in folders. Experiment to experiment, just an insight path that we're on. And yet in the background, all of that information is just accumulating. And I think you really framed the question well and pointed to some technologies that might be helping bridge that gap between our individual experience, which is going to be like very much an adventure and a single trajectory, and then also fleshing out this broader space of, for example, discourse, where we want some way to summarize or even just describe all these trajectories in a way that lets us design better trajectories, or make sure that trajectories aren't like catastrophic or not aligned with people's principles. So
it's like, how many times has the same conversation happened? And like Noam Chomsky will probably say something about like, the generative capacity of language, and it's like, no, but I bet you like semantically probably the same conversation has happened tons of times. And if we had a discourse graph, what kind of more interesting conversations could we have?
sometimes I think about on video conversations like this, could we blur our image with an uncertainty measure, or could I just have it be known that this color framing or this sound effect, that's what it means to me. And it's just a little local language. And here's my cheat sheet. Here's how I'm going to increase the bandwidth of our communication. I'm sharing my screen so that you can see what I'm looking at. And we're hearing the same thing. There's a lot of ways that that meaning bandwidth could be supported. And then how are some of the ways that people might use it? They might want to increase the bandwidth of education and scientific communication. They also might want to increase the intensity of the artistic communication and experience. And then in all those cases, what would be the pure tech answer or a purely engineering answer to increasing bandwidth? Well, we'll have a 4K camera. We'll do 60 frames per second. And all of this, we're increasing the amount of data, but without extra context, that is hitting a point of diminishing returns very, very quickly. Like, in fact, from a meaning perspective, even without video, so much meaning can be conveyed, which is why the telephone is able to be engaging. And yet there are ways that we could think about how to, rather than just generate more gigabytes of video, do something slightly different that would be scientific and technological and artistic, that could give people that same like intuitive feeling of transferred emotion. Like when we look at a painting and we think the painting is like about sadness, or it's communicating sadness or happiness, but that doesn't even mean that the creator was in that state of mind when they made it. They might have just been really stressed about a deadline, or maybe they made half of it, or just a sketch when they were in one state of mind, and then they returned to it at a totally different time. So, yeah, Gokul? Either of you any thoughts, or I'll go to another question.
Yeah. I wanted to point out there's a book called, a short story by Philip K. Dick. I think it's called Home. I think it's called Home. I'm gonna have to look this up later. But it's this book. It's like a short story about like in the future, there's the secret society, and like they've always been part like influencing the course of human history because they were able to create a language that where like how do I explain this? Where like sentences were paragraphs, words were sentences, like syllables were phonemes, and like phonemes were syllables, or something like that. Where like they, it's just fascinating. Like he was thinking like a linguist when he wrote this, where he instead of like thinking about individual words as like like word, it's like I could just say word and then I just communicated an entire novel, right? Because I'm like putting in some information and and it wasn't just English words, it was like a very specific language. And that's not real. Like that couldn't really happen. I appreciate like the magical science fiction component of it, but like or the fantasy component of it, but there's just no way these people would have to have some like crazy like time sampling and like incredible acuity for being able to detect phonemes out of noise. Because like if you look at English phonemes, are like incredibly confusable with each other, and like that's why you have to like spell things out when you're like spelling your, at least when I'm spelling my name out on the phone. So I always find that as like a really great example of kind of how like detail after a certain point just becomes noise. And the Impressionists are a really great example of this. Like you're walking in, you see a Monet, you're like, holy crap, that's beautiful. And then you walk up to it, you're like, oh, that leaf, I want to see like how he made it. And then you zoom in and it's just a color. And you're like, whoa, you have this whole experience. And so I kind of wonder, like in terms of communicating feelings or states or representations, like, how important it is to keep in mind kind of the futile pursuit of trying to be so detail oriented, especially when we're thinking of things like Ethereum and blockchains and computer science and digital systems and, like, oh, it has to be discrete, it has to follow an alphabet and all this stuff. And there's definitely a futility taken to the nth level, like you were saying, with like 4K, right? So yeah, so I think like taking inspiration from the Impressionists and and like letting people fill in the blanks and just giving them like trusting that people are smart. They have this brain that like is kind of crazy, like that it like exists and can do the things that it does, and chances are they'll probably converge to some understanding that's somewhat commensurable, but is probably going to be unique anyway, and that's a good thing.
Let me provide a few short, funny little reflections. So on that language example, sounds like an interesting story. And I thought, how do you compress a whole paper or a whole book of meaning into one sentence? With a citation. So that is in fact a way that we do that. And we just say, this is the case. Boom, hit him with a citation. So that's one funny thing. That mode of communication, which also hyperlinking on the text enables without the APA format and the PLOS format, we can just link the information. So through linking and citations and referencing, we can communicate in that scoped way. And then the second point that was really interesting there, different art formats like pointillism, when you zoom in, or impressionism for that matter, when you zoom in, you're not interacting with the object. Who's to say how the art should be looked at? But it is different when you're zoomed in that close, let's say. And it's also different when you're zoomed out too far. I mean, if you're 10 miles from the museum, you also will not see the Monet. So there's this designed range of distance, in this case, visually, that it makes sense to talk about that level of experience at. And yeah, being 1 centimeter is not going to give you the whole canvas, but then being 100 miles away is also not going to be there. And then thinking about scientific data as pointillism, data pointillism, or with blurs, like a Gaussian blur on everything, what is that meso range where if we have a low replication experiment and we're just super focused on this one specific instance, we're not seeing the big enough picture. But then at the same time, if we try to zoom out to, well, we took the average temperature of the whole world and it was 25°C. It's like, okay, you made the global thermometer. You zoomed out to this one level where also meaning has been lost again. So how do we stay in a sweet spot and design that gallery so that people can be in their sweet spot, because people have different visions and different preferences too. So I think that example brings in a lot from like perspective and accessibility to also the aesthetics of interpreting data, visual data or scientific data. Gokul, would you like to add anything or take it in any way?
It's a very interesting thought that you can look at. So each data point has a story behind it, and then all the points together have a different story to tell. So I mean, it's a very interesting thought there.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm gonna pick a number between 1 and 37, and maybe we can think about just like one or two more points or questions, but really appreciate all the work that the participants in the Curio DAO did to curate this list of questions. How about either of you pick a number between 1 and 37 without looking at any lists you may have been provided?
You go for it, Gokul.
13.
Nice.
Excellent. Name some of the DeSci platforms that are currently running and what are they bringing to the table? Hopefully we'll have a more curated encyclopedia with tagged different resources. So this isn't the final answer, but what's just one DeSci tool that is operating and maybe even in your own workflow, and how do you see that being used? And feel free to mention one that you may have worked on.
I'm gonna go for the self plug here.
Yes,
because
sure.
there aren't there aren't that many DeSci. There are a lot that are under development, and super happy to talk about all those. But you guys should definitely go and check out commons.opsci.io. It's a decentralized data repository built specifically for, if you're a neuroscientist, definitely go check it out, built specifically for neuroscience data sets that are BIDS compliant. So what we've done is built these automated workflows and pipelines that scrape metadata indices and aggregators of public open source data sets and permanently archive them on Filecoin, pin them on IPFS for peer-to-peer sharing. The long-term plan is to build science web apps on top of these for web native, basically browser-based experiences for science, and you can imagine all sorts of artistic, things that could unlock. That's one side of it. The other side of it is we also provide a free deposition service for scientists that have these giant data sets and don't know what to do with it. So like, all right, you finished your NIH grant, you have this 10 terabyte data set, data sharing compliance, data sharing regulations say, or, requirements of your grant say that you have to put it open source somewhere. You go to Figshare and you're like, okay, let me deposit it on Figshare. And you find out that you have to pay anywhere between like $10,000 to $15,000 to deposit your data, plus whatever open access fee you're going to be paying on top of that for the publication related to any of those to any of the papers related to that data set. So it's completely free. However, there's a catch. So we incentivize researchers with this free storage, but they have to first off verify their identity. So they have to have an ORCID, and they need to link their ORCID to an Ethereum account, at least, and at least one other social account. So what this does is it, one, lets us connect Web 2 data to Web 3 data and events. And two, it helps us have a greater degree of certainty that the service isn't being abused. The second requirement is, and I think the most significant one, is that the data has to pass an automated validation check that the data is in a structure that's amenable for reproducibility. And so this kind of really narrows what kind of data can be deposited on this data commons. So we currently only accept BIDS data sets. These are brain information data set structure data sets. So they have to follow very specific, they have to have certain files, the folders have to be named a certain way, et cetera, et cetera. And what's nice about this is that BIDS is something that's accepted by a very wide community, like a very diverse, large community. There's like MRI, EEG, ECOG, so on and so forth. Tons of different modalities. It's not just one lab or one group that uses it. It's a very diverse collective. It's endorsed by a bunch of like data sharing standards and stuff like that. And the cool thing is that you don't have to look at a BIDS data set to write algorithms and do work on it. You can trust that as long as it passes a BIDS validation, you can write a heuristic or an algorithm that'll execute and generate some result. At least in theory. Sometimes in practice, I'm sure there's always like bugs and exceptions and stuff. But yeah, so those are the two requirements. And the goal there really is to kind of get to have this kind of carrot, mostly carrot, not much of a stick approach, but where we encourage researchers to use ORCID, to link it to Web3, to put their data in interoperable standards, and then they get free storage. And then as a result, maybe down the line, as we continue to develop this, they can even get cross discoverability where their data sets might be, used in some Web3 applications. And at the same time, like maybe people are generating art based off of it, and there's that link to their work. Or, if people are searching work IDs for particular types of data sets, they'll be able to resolve and find that record and find that Web3 link. And it'll be an IPFS hash. It's not going to be some, silly DOI that has nothing to do with the content, but it'll actually be a content, checksummed, like actual like string that's related to the contents of the data. So that's my self plug. Definitely go check it out. Let us know what you think, and yeah, feel free to reach out with any questions or anything.
How many data sets are on there right now?
There are, I think, about just over a dozen, about like 15 maybe or 16 data sets. We've indexed about 5 terabytes of data sets, public open access data sets. So we have the metadata from them. We're in the process of very slowly on DigitalOcean with a certain amount of overhead. We're looking at ways to scale this. We're slowly going through and archiving that data, pre-processing it, and depositing it on Filecoin for posterity. And it's very interesting, actually. Some of the data that we've crawled, we've been doing this for about 6 months. We're starting off very small scale, proving out the pipeline, and we're just at the point now where we can start scaling this. We're actually looking for resources and support to help this. And we're at the point now where some of the data that we've archived has fallen off like the index. So, I tried to go and find a particular data set, and it wasn't in the DataLad index. And it turned out that the only version of it was on Filecoin because it turned out that it was archived before it fell off. And so that reminded me, and I was like, hey, like there's value in what we're doing here. And there's value also in these Web3 protocols. They provide an extra level of redundancy that's not related to like any centralized organization.
Wow. It's very interesting, and it shows like the whole scientific supply chain can really be as fragile as one point. Like one person storing a data set can keep a whole line alive. That experiment could have been really important in capturing some element of like experimental phase space. And without the data, people could just say, well, it was done. Oh, we don't have the information. Probably can't be done again or something like that. So that's very, very powerful and interesting. Gokul, anything else that you would add in here? What DeSci or art affordances are you engaging in and finding useful right now?
So since like all DeSci projects are like, most of them are still in very early stages. And since I'm not really in the DeSci space really working in it, so I would say I'm not really using a lot of these tools as of now. I look forward to using them in a few years. But I'm most excited about projects. So of course there are like Vita DAO and DeSci DAO, which I think people know of, who are building this whole ecosystem of doing decentralized research. But then there are these projects which are focusing on changing the publishing system, like peer reviewing and so on. So there is one that I have recently heard of called, it has a very generic name called Decentralized Science, and it provides like a pool of reviewers and which and has a reputation system for the reviewers. And I think that's such projects will be like very beneficial to the space. I don't know if there are more. I think Shari would know more of these projects. So if there are more which are in the pipeline, which I have not heard of yet, but I think these are very, very crucial to like take the. I mean, there is currently like this whole top-down selection in science for impact factors, which again is something determined by the journals, because scientists are so dependent on the whole peer review system and the impact factors. So taking that away from the centralized publishing houses and putting it in the hands of communities, and that would be like really an interesting area of DeSci projects that I'm looking forward to. And decentralized science seems to be aiming to do something in this along these lines. I hope they're like using things like soul-bound tokens or to like have reputation system which are non-transferable and things like this. I mean, you don't want people to trade their reputations in science. That would be, and yeah, I mean, there's also this thing. I mean, this is definitely a good use case of Web3 stack, but also the critic in me, so the whole peer reviewing system never adopted the Web 2, right? So the whole interaction-based peer reviewing never happened. So we are still stuck in this very early days of the last century of peer reviewing. So will there be an adoption for this very new emerging tools that we introduce to the whole scientific community, right? So yeah,
important questions, and in some other DeSci conversations, I've heard people frame this as like a systems view from the top, and thinking about all these just like tectonic aspects that constitute science today and maybe tomorrow, but ranging from the incentives around reviewing and publishing, how are experiments designed, who's doing it. It's like, it's overwhelming, because a university, again, which is just one of the places that research happens, it is like a city, because it has every aspect that constitutes people who live there, people who work there, and everything else associated with that. And how do we invent this new city? Well, that's kind of like the systems view. And then the other side is, let's just say there is some alternative village or city or network of bunkers or whatever it is. What is going to be able to bring people at different stages in their science journey to do that? And how will the game theory, which is sort of structured by those top-down forces, how will that end up relating to a given person's decision? Well, should I make that preprint when it increases the visibility, but also maybe it's going to languish in some format when other people who are going to view it, they want to see it in this peer-reviewed format? And so it's almost like this catch-22, but it's like catch-22 to the 22nd power, because if there was the review system that everybody had in their inbox 0, and you could get a high-quality reviewer today, and then that reviewer were rewarded and their identity were protected, and it were versioned on the living document, and then you could have the zero knowledge proof, it's like, well, yes, then it would be different. But it's not there. So then what is the actual order of operations, basically, that's going to lead to that working? And I guess as we kind of land the plane here, it just reminds me of how the community level, which is from two to many people, but something really happens when people are communicating their ideas, which is even just in the communication, a form of collaboration, bouncing ideas off each other and sharing different perspectives. And along with many other changes, some of these technologies we're discussing empower communities to set their own terms of identity, task allocation, reimbursement. All those city aspects are now not just under the auspice of some legacy institution that existed long before we were born, but it's actually something that we can like be a co-creator with over very short timescales. And so I feel like it's in that openness around scientific groups and teams, relationships and communities and so on, like their ability to be the bottom up while they're defining the top down is going to not succeed in every single combination or case, but in that space, we'll start to see some patterns that thrive. So if both of you would like to, as short or as long as you'd like, provide any closing thoughts, where are we in August 22 in art and DeSci, and where are we headed? Where are you going? Where can people go to go with you?
Yeah. So I can talk about like where Cyberse is going.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
So we are now currently like looking at institutional partners who can promote this idea among their researchers, and we have more submissions. And at the same time, like currently we have this new Curie Hall and Levi Montalcini Hall dedicated to cancer and neuroscience research. So these halls would have like just artworks focused on scientific works which are published in the last couple of years. So yeah, that's something we're looking at. And if people are interested to give their submissions, if they have papers published in the last couple of years on neurobiology or cancer, feel free to drop a mail to us.
Awesome. Shady?
Yeah, I'm super excited about the future of digital spaces for curated works of science and arts. Big supporter of kind of the vision that you have, Gokul, and rooting you on, and definitely happy to provide submissions and any support along the way. Really excited to see that work come together. For myself, yeah, so I definitely want to make sure that we shout out some of the other DeSci projects in the space. I'm incredibly kind of awestruck by the vision of DeSci Labs and thinking about how do we go from 0 to 1,000 with DeSci today in a way that doesn't make the community or the products or the technology vulnerable for either acquisition or roadblocking by existing powers, right, or existing entrenched interests. So DeSci Labs, definitely go check them out. They, briefly what they're doing is forking the scientific record. And there's a couple different strategies they're implementing for this. Very much, I think they have their heads on the right way. They're thinking about kind of how browser-based experiences in the future are going to be dominated by extensions, right? So, the platforms can control, the existing Web2 platforms are going to keep doing business as usual. They're going to, keep continuing to silo your data. However, the browser extensions, the code that you can run client side, can interact with these data objects in ways that these big tech corporations can't really close the lid on. So, I'm really looking forward to the DeSci Nodes browser extension, which will allow you to interact with any PDF or any knowledge object that's out there, identify its linked data, traverse its discourse graph, mint impact certificates that are based off of the data, perform replications in browser, in like a Google Collaboratory or in any like Jupyter notebook. Definitely go check out their Discord. They do product demos and office hours once a week. They're actively onboarding beta testers as well. So if you want to test out DeSci nodes and try doing research with it, they would be really, really grateful for the work that they're doing. Also really excited because we're working together with them to integrate authenticated identities for researchers that are coming into that ecosystem. So we're looking at ways that we can pursue that together. Definitely also take a look at LabDAO if you haven't. LabDAO has, it started off as kind of a life sciences focus, as many of these biotech, kind of like lab, DAOs like Beta DAO or Molecule or Sci DAO, just because I think of the intersection between like VC, Web3, and that's where the money is, and so that's where the attention goes, and that's where the business models really kind of come out. But LabDAO kind of, I think, did something really impressive where they started off as, okay, we're going to create a Craigslist for PCR providers so that anyone who has an idea anywhere in the world can be matched with a service provider that can run the experiment for them. And we're going to do this in a decentralized, marketplace. We're going to have, provenance and execution, and we're going to have metadata structures to like capture the data and publish it and all this good stuff on chain. And so now they've kind of grown out to be kind of a generic lab in the decentralized cloud, and they're kind of really pioneering the way, like many different ways that we can think about decentralized work in science. And that's like a very Web3 focus. And of course, I think right along those lines, the stuff that Active Inference is doing with the Institute in terms of, just digital, completely web native ways. And I'm super excited to see these different methods and applications converge, and maybe lessons learned, and hopefully new technologies come out of that. There's other projects too, and I don't want to do a disservice by mentioning some and not the others, but definitely go check out Ultra Rare, which has a list of all of the DeSci projects. And I think there's also one on the Active Inference Coda, which complements it. So if you can't find one on one, you'll be able to find the other on the other. And as for me with OpSci, so for OpSci, we're actively exploring and performing concept development of what does an open science society look like, and how do we tap into technologies like impact certificate markets, soulbound tokens, and basically decentralized workflows for coordination on research, running on top of DeSci nodes or whatever, or like service providers and LabDAO. And how do we build a professional society that doesn't require affiliation with particular types of institutions to be able to do rigorous good science? So actively exploring that. If you want to get involved, do check us out at, you can check out our blog. Actually, you can see kind of how we're thinking about things at pulse.opsci.io. That's pulse.opsci.io, and opsci.io. And check us out there. We have forums as well. You can feel free to comment and post and tell us your best and craziest ideas. And I think that's it. That's my wrap up. Thanks a lot for having me on, Daniel. It was a lot of fun to chat about all this stuff.
It's fun, and we covered a lot. We entered the triangle of the infinite game of art and science and tech, and can't say we left unscarred, but a lot of good topics did come up. And I know what you mean. Like every time I search for DeSci, I feel like there's new important threads that are opening, and a lot of that like reflexivity, and like we need this way to make sense of how much is happening out there so that we can make sense of it. We need to automate the automation. And I agree, it'd be an awesome discussion. Like this is the first Curio semi-hosted art and DeSci discussion. So big appreciation to both of you and to Max for joining. And I agree, it'd be awesome, like truly in the spirit of art, NFTs, and Curio and DeSci. Let's be active by the active, and people who want to come on and share something, and people who would like to juxtapose or take any view. And that's what hopefully these amazing technologies can allow as we stand on our Web 2 springboard using YouTube et al., jumping into something potentially quite different. So thank
Yeah.
you both. And thanks to everybody
Yeah.
who's watching live and in replay.
Yeah, I have to add that I'm really impressed by the tools that DeSci and LabDAO is building. These are like the foundational tools that we need for having an open science community. So yeah, it's really good work and good luck. And yeah, thanks for having me here.
Okay, best of luck with your projects and work, everybody, and see you next time.
Thank you.
See you next time. Bye.
Bye.